Lyria stood in chains before the alien council, and her silver hair fell down her back like flowing water, and her violet eyes stared at the 7 species who would decide if she lived or died, and beside her was Ember, and the dragon's red and gold scales shimmered under the bright lights, and smoke came from her nose because she was angry and scared, and both of them were trapped by energy bonds that burned if they moved too much. The council chamber was made of crystal, and it was so big that Lyria felt very small, and hundreds of aliens sat watching her, and they whispered to each other, and she could hear words like monster and killer and murderer, and she wanted to scream that they did not understand, but her voice would not come out. Chancellor Vex moved forward, and his tentacles waved in the air, and he spoke in a voice that echoed through the hall. And he said that Lyria was charged with destroying the Korvax colony on planet Theta 9. And he said 17,000 people died in the fire, and he said the evidence was clear, and there was no doubt she did it. Lyria remembered that day, and she remembered the flames and the screaming, and she remembered how Ember had flown over the colony breathing fire until everything turned to ash. And yes, she had done it, and she would not lie about it, but they did not ask why she did it, and they did not want to know the truth. In the observer seat sat Captain Maya Brooks from Earth, and she wore her blue uniform with the medals on her chest, and her brown hair was pulled back tight, and her face was hard like stone. And Maya had been to Theta 9 after the fire, and she had seen things that the council investigators never looked for, and she had seen the truth. Maya watched as the council prepared to vote on the death sentence, and her hands gripped the armrests of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white, and she knew what they were going to do, and she knew it was wrong, and she could not stay silent. When Chancellor Vex asked if anyone wished to speak before the sentence was given, Maya stood up fast, and her chair made a loud scraping sound, and everyone turned to look at her. And she said loudly that she invoked Article 12 of the Galactic Charter, and she wanted to speak for Lyria. The whole chamber went silent, and aliens stared at her with wide eyes, and some had mouths that hung open, and some made clicking sounds of surprise, and a human speaking for someone accused of genocide had never happened before. In all the years of the Galactic Council, Vex's tentacles stopped moving. And he looked at Maya with his 3 black eyes, and he said that humans were new to the galaxy and should not interfere in matters they did not understand. And Maya said she understood perfectly, and that was why she had to speak. Lyria looked at Maya for the first time, and their eyes met across the chamber, and Lyria saw something in the human woman's face that she had not seen in a long time, and it was belief and maybe even hope. And Lyria felt something crack inside her chest where her heart had turned to ice. The council members argued among themselves, and their translators made a dozen different sounds and beeps and clicks, and finally Vex raised one tentacle for silence, and he said that Maya could speak, but she had better make it worth their time. Maya walked down to the center platform, and her boots made sharp sounds on the crystal floor, and she carried a small data chip in her hand, and when she reached the podium she looked up at all the powerful aliens who ran the galaxy, and she was not afraid. She told them that before they killed Lyria, they needed to hear what their own investigators had ignored, and Vex said that the investigation was complete and thorough, and Maya said it was a lie. She put the data chip into the main computer, and suddenly the air above the chamber filled with holographic images, and aliens gasped, and some covered their eyes, and some made sounds of horror. The images showed rooms full of cages, and inside the cages were people and children and creatures from many different species, and they were hurt and cut open and kept alive, while Korvax scientists did experiments on them, and in one image there was a young elf boy on a metal table, and his wings were pinned down, and his chest was open, and his eyes were still looking around. Maya said that the Korvax called this place a research facility, and they had been stealing people from across 12 sectors for 3 years. And Lyria's little brother was one of the victims. And when Lyria found out what happened to him, she went to the Galactic Peacekeepers and filed reports and begged them to help. But they did nothing because the Korvax had money and political power. Lyria's hands shook in her chains, and one tear fell down her face, and Ember made a low, sad sound that echoed through the chamber. Maya kept talking, and she said that when the law failed, Lyria took justice into her own hands, and yes, she burned the colony. But everyone there knew about the experiments, and they all helped, and they all got paid for it. The council exploded into shouting and arguing, and some members stood up and pointed at others, and Vex demanded order, but no one listened. And Maya stood at the podium with her arms crossed and waited for them to calm down. Finally, Vex shouted loud enough that everyone stopped, and he said that even if this was true, it did not excuse killing thousands of people, and Maya looked right at him and said they were not innocent. She brought up more files and showed communication records and money transfers and shipping logs, and all of it proved that the whole colony knew what was happening, and they all participated and they all profited from the suffering. One council member asked why the official investigators found none of this evidence, and Maya said because someone with power made sure it was hidden and that someone was in this room right now. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb about to explode, and Vex moved toward Maya with his tentacles spreading wide, and he said she could not accuse a council member without proof, and Maya said she had plenty of proof. She explained that the Korvax research was funded by a group of species who wanted to make biological weapons, and they planned to use these weapons against species they thought were weak, and that included humans and elves. Lyria finally found her voice, and she spoke, and her words were like wind through trees, and she said they took everything from her and her brother, and her faith in justice. And when she found her brother on that table with his eyes still open and still aware, she knew mercy had failed. She said yes, she burned them, and yes, Ember helped her, and they became monsters because the law would not protect the innocent, and civilization had turned its back on the suffering. The chamber was completely silent now, and everyone stared at Lyria, and some looked ashamed, and some looked angry, and some looked thoughtful. Maya said that Lyria deserved a fair trial, and not an execution based on a corrupt investigation, and the council needed to decide if they cared about real justice or just the appearance of order. Chancellor Vex's tentacles drooped, and he looked old and tired, and he said the council would recess and investigate these new claims, and the trial would resume in 1 week. As guards led Lyria away, she looked back at Maya, and their eyes met again, and Lyria mouthed the words, "Thank you." And Maya nodded once, and then Lyria and Ember were gone, and Maya sat back down in the observer section and wondered if she had just saved a life or only delayed the inevitable. The next 7 days felt like 7 years for everyone involved, and Maya spent every hour gathering more evidence and interviewing witnesses and following trails of money and secrets that led to the darkest corners of the galaxy, and what she found made her sick, but also made her more determined to expose the truth. Lyria sat in her detention cell, and the walls were made of energy fields that stopped her from using any of her natural abilities, and in another cell far away, Ember was kept sedated because the council feared what an angry dragon might do, and Lyria could feel her companions' drugged sleep through their bond. And it hurt worse than any chains. Maya came to visit on the 3rd day, and she brought files and images on a data pad, and she sat outside the energy barrier and showed Lyria what she had discovered, and it was worse than either of them had. Imagine the Korvax experiments were just one part of a much bigger conspiracy, and at least 5 council members were involved, and they had been funding research into biological weapons for over a decade, and their goal was to create diseases and toxins that would only affect certain species and leave others unharmed. Maya explained that they planned to use these weapons to wipe out species they considered inferior or troublesome, and humans were high on the list because Earth had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, and already they were gaining too much influence, and the old powers did not like that. Lyria listened, and her violet eyes grew darker with each revelation, and she asked why Maya was doing this and risking her career and maybe her life to help someone she barely knew. Maya was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that when she was younger she had been a soldier, and she had seen her own government cover up a massacre to protect political interests, and good people died, and the truth was buried, and she had promised herself that if she ever had a chance to stop that from happening again, she would take it no matter the cost. She said that what happened to Lyria's brother and all the other victims was evil, and what the council did by ignoring it was almost as evil, and someone had to stand up and say this is wrong, and if that someone had to be her, then so be it. Lyria felt something she had not felt in years, and it was gratitude, and not just for the help, but for the reminder that there were still people in the galaxy who cared about what was right. Meanwhile, the Council's own investigation was moving forward, and independent investigators brought in from neutral species started finding all the evidence that had been hidden, and Council members started resigning, and some disappeared in the middle of the night before they could be arrested. Chancellor Vex was taken into custody on the 5th day, and the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he had accepted millions in bribes from the Korvax leadership, and he had personally ordered the original investigation to ignore certain facilities and certain financial records. The galaxy watched in shock as one of the most powerful political figures was led away in chains, and news broadcasts showed the footage over, and debates raged on every world about corruption and justice and what it meant to be civilized. On the 6th day, Maya received a message from an anonymous source, and it contained files that showed the full scope of the conspiracy. And there were names and dates and locations and proof of weapons testing on unwilling subjects, and some of those subjects were human colonists who had disappeared from frontier worlds. Maya took this information directly to the new interim council leadership, and they were horrified, and they immediately issued warrants for dozens of arrests, and military ships were dispatched to shut down secret research facilities on 7 different planets. But through all of this, Lyria's fate was still undecided, and the law was clear that genocide required the death penalty regardless of circumstances, and many council members argued that making an exception would set a dangerous precedent. Maya argued back that ignoring the context of Lyria's actions would be an even worse injustice, and she pointed out that the council had failed in its most basic duty to protect the innocent, and Lyria had only done what they should have done. The debate went on for hours, and then days, and the galaxy was divided between those who saw Lyria as a victim who struck back and those who saw her as a mass murderer who must pay for her crimes. Lyria told Maya to stop fighting because she was tired, and part of her wanted the peace that death would bring, and she said that even if she lived, she would never be free of the memories and the guilt and the nightmares. Maya refused. And she said that Lyria did not get to give up because too many people had already given up, and that was how monsters like the Korvax got away with their crimes for so long. She said that if Lyria really wanted to honor her brother's memory, then she needed to live and fight and make sure nothing like this ever happened again. On the 7th day, the new council announced that the trial would resume, and they had made their decision about Lyria's sentence, and the whole galaxy held its breath. Maya sat in the observer gallery again, and this time her entire crew was with her, and they wore their dress uniforms, and they sat straight and proud, because they believed in what their captain was doing. Lyria was brought into the Hall of Memory instead of the regular tribunal chamber, and this was significant because the Hall of Memory was where the galaxy recorded its greatest mistakes and darkest moments as warnings to future generations. The interim chancellor was a being called Elder Cress from the Mindari species, and she was ancient and wise and known for her fairness, and she floated in her meditation sphere at the center of the hall. Elder Cress spoke in a voice that was gentle but firm, and she said that the council had reviewed all evidence, and they had weighed justice against mercy and law against circumstance. She said that Lyria had committed an act of terrible violence, and 17,000 beings had died, and that could not be ignored or excused. But she also said that Lyria had acted in response to an act of terrible evil, and that evil had been enabled and protected by the very institutions that were supposed to prevent it. The hall was so quiet that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Elder Cress continued and said that the council had decided that executing Lyria would not serve justice, and it would only add another tragedy to a situation already filled with tragedy. Instead, Lyria and Ember would be conscripted into the galactic peacekeeping force for 100 years, and during that time, they would hunt down and dismantle the remaining elements of the biological weapons conspiracy. It was punishment and redemption combined, and it gave Lyria a purpose and a chance to turn her rage into something constructive. Elder Cress added that Captain Maya Brooks would be appointed as Lyria's commanding officer and liaison because Earth had shown wisdom and courage in this matter. Maya felt tears in her eyes, but she did not let them fall, and around her the crew members smiled and some clasped her shoulders in congratulations. Lyria stood in the center of the hall, and she looked up at Elder Cress, and she asked if she could see Ember, and the Chancellor said yes, and guards brought the dragon in, and when Ember saw Lyria, she made a sound of pure joy. The energy bonds were removed, and Lyria ran to her companion and threw her arms around the dragon's neck, and Ember wrapped her wings around Lyria, and they stood there holding each other while the galaxy watched. Maya walked down to them, and when Lyria looked up, her violet eyes were wet with tears, and she said she did not know how to thank the human woman. Maya smiled and said that thanks were not necessary, and all she wanted was for Lyria to help her make the galaxy a better place. Lyria nodded and said she would try, and for the first time in years, she felt like maybe there was a reason to keep living. The three of them stood together in the Hall of Memory, and they did not know it yet, but they were about to change the galaxy forever. The ship called Horizon's Edge left the council station 3 days after the sentencing, and on board were Maya and her crew, along with Lyria and Ember, and the dragon had to stay in a specially modified cargo bay that was big enough for her to move around, but also reinforced so she could not break through if she got angry. Maya stood on the bridge and looked at the star charts, and their first target was a research facility on a moon called Dust Harbor, and intelligence reports said the facility was still operating and still conducting illegal experiments, and Maya intended to shut it down permanently. Lyria came to the bridge, and she moved quietly like a shadow, and Maya had learned that elves could be very silent when they wanted to be. And Lyria looked at the star charts and asked what the plan was. Maya explained that they would approach Dust Harbor under the guise of a standard inspection, and once they were inside, they would gather evidence and arrest everyone involved, and if anyone resisted, they would use whatever force was necessary. Lyria asked if Maya was prepared for what they might find, and Maya said she had seen the files and the images and nothing could surprise her anymore. But Lyria shook her head and said, seeing pictures was different from seeing the real thing, and the smell and the sounds would stay with Maya forever. They arrived at Dust Harbor after 2 days of travel, and the moon was gray and lifeless, and the research facility was built into the side of a crater, and it looked like just another mining operation, but Maya knew better. The facility administrator was a Korvax named Drell, and he smiled when Maya and her team came aboard, and he said he was happy to cooperate with the inspection, and he offered them refreshments and gave them a tour of the public areas. Maya played along, and she smiled back and asked questions and took notes and all the... While her team was secretly scanning the facility and mapping its layout and looking for hidden areas, Lyria stayed on the ship with Ember because the sight of her would have raised alarms, but she was connected to Maya through a communication device, and she listened to everything. It took 4 hours before Maya's scanners found what they were looking for, and deep below the main facility there were shielded chambers that did not appear on any official blueprints, and the energy readings suggested medical equipment and life support systems. Maya told Drell that she needed to inspect the lower levels, and his smile disappeared, and he said those areas were off-limits due to dangerous atmospheric conditions, and Maya said that was fine, and she would just include that in her report to the council. Drell's face went pale, and he started making excuses and saying maybe he could get special permission, and Maya knew she had him. She gave a signal and her security team drew their weapons and Drell tried to run, but he did not get far, and within minutes Maya's people had control of the facility and were rounding up all the staff. Maya went down to the hidden chambers herself, and what she found there made her stop breathing for a moment. There were 32 prisoners in various states of experimentation, and some were barely alive, and some were so changed by what had been done to them that they did not look like their original species anymore. Maya called Lyria and told her to bring Ember, and they needed medical supplies and containment gear, and Lyria heard something in Maya's voice that scared her. When Lyria arrived at the lower levels, she saw what Maya had found, and even though she had seen similar things before, it still hit her like a physical blow, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Ember smelled the fear and pain and suffering, and she roared so loud that the whole facility shook, and her eyes glowed with fire, and Maya had to calm her down before she burned everything. They worked for hours to free the prisoners and stabilize them, and Maya's medical officer said some of them would need months of treatment, and some would never fully recover, and 2 of them died despite everything they tried. Lyria found a young girl in one of the cells, and she was maybe 10 years old by human standards, and she was from a species Lyria did not recognize, and her arms had been replaced with mechanical appendages that looked like weapons. The girl was terrified, and she screamed when Lyria approached, but Lyria knelt down and spoke softly and told her she was safe now and no one would hurt her anymore. It took a long time, but eventually the girl stopped screaming, and she let Lyria pick her up and carry her to the medical bay. And all the while, Lyria whispered promises that she would protect her. Maya arrested Drell and 17 staff members, and she seized all their research data and sent it back to the council as evidence, and then she made a decision that surprised everyone. She told Lyria to have Ember burn the facility to the ground. Lyria looked at her with wide eyes and asked if Maya was sure, because that was exactly what Lyria had done to the Korvax colony, and it was why she had been sentenced to death. Maya said she was sure, and this place was a monument to cruelty, and it needed to be erased from existence, and besides, this time it was sanctioned by her authority as a galactic peacekeeper. Ember did not need to be told twice, and she flew above the facility and opened her jaws, and fire poured out like a river of molten gold, and the buildings melted and collapsed, and within an hour nothing remained but slag and ash. The rescued prisoners were taken aboard the Horizon's Edge, and Maya's crew worked around the clock to care for them, and some of them started to recover, and some just stared at walls and did not speak. The young girl that Lyria had rescued stayed close to the elf woman, and she followed her everywhere, and Lyria did not mind, and she even smiled sometimes when the girl asked questions. Maya watched them together, and she saw how gentle Lyria could be, despite everything she had been through, and Maya thought that maybe there was hope for all of them. They delivered Drell and his staff to a council prison, and they turned over all the evidence, and then they received their next assignment. There were 6 more facilities, like Dust Harbor, scattered across the galaxy, and Maya's mission was to shut them all down and rescue anyone still being held prisoner. Lyria asked Maya how she was holding up, and Maya admitted that seeing those prisoners had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, and she wondered how many more people were suffering in secret. Lyria said that was why they had to keep going, and they could not save everyone, but they could save some, and that was better than saving none. Over the next few months, they hit 3 more facilities, and each time they found prisoners, and each time they gathered evidence, and each time Ember burned the buildings to ash. Maya noticed that Lyria was changing, and the ice around her heart was starting to melt, and she laughed sometimes, and she spent time with the rescued prisoners and helped them heal. The young girl, whose name was Kira, became like a daughter to Lyria, and she taught Kira about the stars and about honor and about how to be strong. Even when the world was cruel, Maya's crew accepted Lyria as one of their own, and they saw how hard she worked and how much she cared, and they stopped thinking of her as a criminal and started thinking of her as a hero. But not everyone in the galaxy agreed, and there were protests on some worlds, and people said that Lyria should have been executed and giving her a second chance was a mistake. Maya ignored the critics and kept working, and she knew that actions spoke louder than words, and every person they saved was proof that they were doing the right thing. On their fourth mission, they ran into trouble, and the facility was guarded by mercenaries, and a fight broke out, and Maya's people were pinned down. Lyria and Ember went into action, and the dragon flew over the battlefield, breathing fire, while Lyria fought with a grace and speed that seemed impossible. She moved like water and struck like lightning, and the mercenaries did not stand a chance, and within minutes the fight was over. Maya's security chief said he had never seen anyone fight like that, and Lyria said her people had been warriors for thousands of years before humans even discovered fire, and fighting was in her blood. They freed 23 prisoners from that facility, and among them was an elderly human man who had been missing for 5 years, and when Maya told him he was going home, he cried. These small victories added up, and Maya started to believe that maybe they really could make a difference, and maybe 100 years would not be enough to undo all the damage. But it was a start. Lyria stood on the observation deck one night and looked at the stars, and Ember's head rested on her shoulder, and Maya came to stand beside them. Lyria said she had been thinking about her brother and how he would feel about what she was doing now, and Maya asked what conclusion she had reached. Lyria said she thought he would be proud, and that made her smile. Even though it also made her sad, Maya put a hand on Lyria's shoulder and said that the best way to honor the dead was to protect the living, and Lyria was doing that every day. They stood there together watching the stars, and somewhere out there were more facilities and more prisoners and more people who needed saving, and they would find them all. After 8 months of hunting down illegal facilities, Maya and her team had rescued over 200 prisoners and arrested nearly 100 conspirators, and the galaxy was starting to take notice, and news broadcasts called them heroes, and some called them vigilantes, but no one could deny they were getting results. But success made them a target, and there were powerful people who did not want their secrets exposed, and they decided that Maya and Lyria needed to be stopped permanently. The attack came without warning when Horizon's Edge was traveling through deep space between missions, and suddenly alarms started blaring, and the ship shuddered as weapons fire hit the shields. Maya ran to the bridge, and her crew was already at battle stations, and on the view screen she saw 3 warships bearing down on them, and they were firing everything they had. The ships were unmarked, but their weapons were military grade, and Maya knew instantly that this was not random pirates, and someone had sent assassins after them. She ordered evasive maneuvers and returned fire, but Horizon's Edge was a diplomatic vessel, not a warship, and they were badly outgunned, and the shields were already failing. Lyria appeared on the bridge and asked what she could do, and Maya told her to get to the cargo bay and protect Ember, because if the ship was boarded, the dragon would be their last line of defense. But Lyria had a different idea, and she said that Ember could fly in space for short periods, using her natural fire to propel herself, and if they opened the cargo bay doors, Ember could attack the enemy ships directly. Maya said that was insane, and Lyria would die in the vacuum of space, and Lyria smiled and said she had elven magic that would protect her for a few minutes, and that was all she needed. There was no time to argue, and Maya gave the order and the cargo bay doors opened, and Ember launched herself into space with Lyria on her back, and both of them were surrounded by a shimmering shield of silver light. The enemy ships did not expect this, and they hesitated for a crucial moment. And that was all Ember needed, and she flew straight at the nearest warship, breathing a stream of fire that cut through its hull like paper. The ship exploded in a ball of flame and debris, and Ember was already moving toward the second target, and Lyria held on tight and guided her companion with their mental bond. The second ship tried to run, but Ember was faster, and she caught up and wrapped her claws around its engine section and tore it apart, and the ship went spinning off into space, disabled and helpless. The third ship's captain must have realized he was outmatched because he opened a communication channel and demanded to speak with Maya. Maya accepted the call, and the captain's face appeared on her screen, and he was a Threx, which was a species known for being mercenaries and soldiers for hire. He said that he had been paid a fortune to destroy Horizon's Edge and kill everyone aboard, and he would not say who hired him, but he made it clear it was someone very powerful. Maya offered him a deal, and she said if he surrendered and told her everything he knew, she would make sure he got a reduced sentence, and if he refused, Ember would destroy his ship, just like she destroyed the others. The captain looked out his viewport at the dragon floating in space, surrounded by silver light, and her eyes glowing like stars, and he made the smart choice and surrendered. Lyria and Ember returned to the ship, and the cargo bay doors closed. And as soon as they were inside, Lyria collapsed, and the magical shield vanished, and she was gasping for air. Maya rushed down to the cargo bay and found Lyria on the floor with Kira holding her hand, and Ember curled protectively around both of them. The medical officer said Lyria had pushed herself too hard, and using that much magic in the vacuum of space had nearly killed her, but she would recover with rest. Maya sat beside Lyria and waited for her to wake up, and when she finally did, Lyria's first words were to ask if everyone was safe. Maya said yes. Everyone was safe because of what Lyria had done, and Lyria smiled weakly and said that was good. The captured mercenary captain was interrogated, and he confirmed what Maya had suspected, and he had been hired by a group of former council members who were still free and still trying to protect the conspiracy. These former council members had vast resources and connections, and they had decided that the best way to stop the investigation was to eliminate the investigators. Maya sent an encrypted message to Elder Cress and the council leadership, and she explained what had happened, and she included all the information from the mercenary captain. The council was alarmed, and they assigned additional security to Maya's mission, and they also intensified their efforts to track down the remaining conspirators. But Maya knew that security could only do so much, and the real solution was to find the people giving the orders and put them in prison before they could send more assassins. She spent days analyzing the data from the facilities they had raided and looking for patterns and connections, and slowly a picture began to emerge. The conspiracy was bigger than anyone had realized, and it went all the way back to the founding of the Galactic Council 70 years ago, and some of the most respected families in the galaxy were involved. Maya felt overwhelmed by the scope of it, and she wondered if they could ever truly win against such entrenched power. Lyria recovered from her injuries, and she found Maya sitting alone in her quarters, staring at data files and looking exhausted. Lyria sat down beside her and asked what was wrong, and Maya admitted that she was starting to doubt whether they could make a real difference. Lyria listened, and then she told Maya a story about her people and how thousands of years ago, the elven nations had been enslaved by a powerful empire, and everyone thought they would never be free. But a small group of rebels refused to give up, and they fought for generations, and eventually they won. And the empire fell, and the elves reclaimed their freedom. Lyria said that change never came easy and powerful. People never gave up their power willingly, and sometimes you had to fight battles you could not win just to inspire others to keep fighting. Maya asked if Lyria really believed that, and Lyria said she did, because she had seen what one human woman was willing to do to stand up for what was right, and if Maya could do that, then anyone could. Maya felt her determination returning, and she thanked Lyria, and they went back to work together. The next target was not a research facility, but a safe house where 3 former council members were hiding, and Maya received intelligence that they were planning to flee the galaxy entirely. She could not let that happen, and she organized a raid with the help of galactic peacekeepers who were loyal to the new council leadership. The raid was fast and brutal, and the former council members tried to resist, but they were no match for trained soldiers, and within an hour, they were in custody. Maya personally questioned one of them, and his name was Senator Vorin, and he had been one of the most vocal opponents of the investigation. Vorin laughed at Maya and said she had no idea how deep this went, and even if she arrested everyone involved, the conspiracy would continue because it was built into the very structure of galactic society. Maya said that might be true, but every person she arrested and every prisoner she saved was a crack in that structure, and eventually the whole thing would come crashing down. Vorin stopped laughing, and he realized she was serious, and for the first time he looked afraid. Over the next few months, Maya and Lyria worked with council investigators to unravel the full extent of the conspiracy, and it was worse than they imagined. There were over 40 research facilities spread across the galaxy, and hundreds of people were involved, and the total number of victims was in the thousands. But they also found allies, and there were honest council members and military officers and civilians who were horrified by what they learned and wanted to help. A movement started, and people began calling it the Justice Coalition, and they demanded reforms and accountability and an end to the corruption that had allowed such evil to flourish. Maya became the face of this movement, even though she never wanted that role, and everywhere she went, people asked her to speak and to tell her story. Lyria stayed in the background and preferred to let Maya have the spotlight, but she was always there supporting her friend and protecting her from threats. Kira grew stronger and healthier, and she started training with Lyria to learn how to fight and defend herself, and she said she wanted to help save people just like she had been saved. Ember became something of a legend, and children across the galaxy drew pictures of the dragon who fought for justice, and adults told stories about her in taverns and meeting halls. 2 years into their mission, Maya received a message from Elder Cress, and the council wanted to meet with her and Lyria to discuss something important. They traveled to the council station, and when they arrived, they were greeted like heroes, and crowds cheered and cameras flashed. In the council chamber, Elder Cress announced that due to their exceptional service, Lyria's sentence was being reduced from 100 years to 25 years, and after that she would be free. Lyria was stunned, and she looked at Maya with tears in her eyes, and Maya was smiling and crying at the same time. But Elder Cress was not finished, and she said that the council was also creating a new organization called the Protection Force, and its mission would be to prevent atrocities like the ones they had uncovered. She asked Maya to lead this new organization and to continue the work she had started. Maya looked at Lyria and then at her crew, and then at all the people they had saved who were watching from the gallery, and she said yes. The galaxy was changing, and it was changing because ordinary people had decided that evil would not go unchallenged, and Maya and Lyria were proof that even one person could make a difference. They still had enemies, and there were still battles to fight, but for the first time in a long time, they had hope. 23 years had passed since Lyria stood in chains before the Galactic Council and faced a death sentence, and now she stood in the same chamber, but everything was different, and she wore the uniform of the Protection Force, and beside her stood Maya, who had gray in her hair now, but the same fire in her eyes. The galaxy had changed in those years, and the reforms they had fought for were now law, and the research facilities were all shut down, and the conspirators were in prison or dead, and new safeguards were in place to prevent such atrocities from happening again. But the work was never truly finished, and there were always new threats and new injustices, and the Protection Force had grown to over 10,000 members from dozens of species, all dedicated to protecting the innocent. Lyria had become one of the most respected officers in the organization, and she trained new recruits and led missions and saved lives, and sometimes when she closed her eyes, she could still see her brother's face. But now the memory brought more peace than pain. Ember was older, too, and her scales had darkened to a deep crimson, and she moved a little slower, but she was still fierce and loyal and ready to fight. When needed, Kira had grown into a young woman, and she was now a protection force officer herself, and she specialized in rescuing children from dangerous situations, and she was brilliant at it because she understood their fear and their trauma. Maya ran the protection force with wisdom and compassion, and under her leadership it had become the most trusted law enforcement organization in the galaxy. And when people were in trouble, they called for the protection force, not the corrupt peacekeepers of the old days. The council chamber was packed for this special ceremony, and representatives from every member species were present along with hundreds of civilians who had been saved by the protection force. Over the years, Elder Cress was still the council leader, and she was incredibly old now, but her mind was sharp, and her dedication to justice had never wavered. She called the assembly to order and announced that today was a historic day because Lyria of the Aetherin had completed her sentence and was now a free citizen with all rights and privileges restored. The crowd erupted in applause, and Lyria felt tears on her cheeks, and Maya hugged her tight and whispered that she was proud of her. But Elder Cress had more to say, and she announced that the council was creating a new medal called the Star of Redemption, and it would be awarded to individuals who overcame terrible circumstances to serve the greater good. Lyria was the first recipient, and when Elder Cress placed the medal around her neck, the entire chamber stood and cheered. After the ceremony, there was a reception, and hundreds of people wanted to meet Lyria and shake her hand and thank her for everything she had done. Among them was the elderly human man they had rescued years ago, and he told Lyria that he had grandchildren now, and they grew up in a safer galaxy because of her. There was the young girl from Dust Harbor, who was now a doctor helping other survivors of experimentation heal from their trauma. There were families who had lost loved ones to the conspiracy, but found closure when the perpetrators were brought to justice. Each person had a story, and each story reminded Lyria why the pain had been worth it. Maya found her on the observation deck late that night, and Lyria was looking out at the stars with Ember's head resting on her shoulder. Maya asked what Lyria was going to do with her freedom, and Lyria laughed and said she had no idea because she had not thought beyond surviving each day. Maya said she had a suggestion, and she asked if Lyria would consider staying with the protection force as a permanent member, not as a sentenced criminal, but as a volunteer. Lyria was surprised, and she asked if Maya was sure she wanted that, and Maya said there was no one she trusted more. Lyria thought about it, and she realized that the protection force had become her family, and the work they did gave her life, meaning, and leaving would feel like losing herself. She said yes, and Maya smiled, and they shook hands like the partners they had become. The next morning, they received an urgent message, and there were reports of illegal weapons testing on a remote colony, and the local authorities were either unable or unwilling to investigate. Maya assembled a team, and of course Lyria and Ember were part of it, and Kira volunteered as well. They took a fast ship and arrived at the colony within 2 days, and what they found confirmed their worst fears, and someone was trying to restart the biological weapons program. The facility was hidden underground and guarded by mercenaries, but they were no match for the protection force team. Lyria and Ember led the assault, and they moved with the perfect coordination that came from decades of fighting side by side. The mercenaries surrendered quickly when they realized they were facing the legendary Dragon Rider and her companion. Inside the facility, they found evidence of new experiments, and Maya was furious because they had worked so hard to end this, and here it was starting again. But they also found something else, and there were detailed records of who was funding this new operation, and the names included some very powerful people who thought they were above the law. Maya sent the evidence directly to Elder Cress, and within hours, warrants were issued and arrests were made. The message was clear, and the galaxy would not tolerate a return to the old ways, and anyone who tried would face the full force of justice. After the mission was complete, Lyria sat with Kira, and they talked about the future, and Kira asked if the fighting would ever end. Lyria said honestly that she did not know, and there would always be people who chose cruelty over compassion and power over justice. But she also said that as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight back, evil would never truly win. Kira asked if Lyria ever regretted what she did to the Korvax colony all those years ago. Lyria was quiet for a long time, and then she said she regretted the person she had to become to do it. And she regretted that the galaxy had failed so completely that extreme action became necessary. But she did not regret saving the people who would have died if she had done nothing. Kira understood, and she said that sometimes the right choice was not the easy choice, and sometimes heroes had to make terrible sacrifices. Years continued to pass, and the protection force grew stronger, and Maya eventually retired from active duty, but stayed on as an advisor. Lyria took over as the organization's field commander, and under her leadership they stopped 3 attempts to restart illegal experimentation programs and rescued over 5,000 people from various forms of exploitation. Ember grew old, and eventually she could no longer fly, but she lived peacefully in a sanctuary the protection force built for retired service animals, and Lyria visited her every week. When Ember finally died of old age, Lyria felt like part of her soul had been torn away, but she also felt gratitude for all the years they had together and all the good they had done. The council built a statue of Ember in the Hall of Memory, and beneath it were the words, "In memory of courage, compassion, and the bond between souls." Lyria continued serving for another 30 years, until her own age caught up with her, and when she finally retired, she had saved more lives than anyone could count. On her last day, Maya came to see her off, and they were both very old now, but their friendship had never wavered. Maya asked if Lyria had any regrets, and Lyria said her only regret was that her brother never got to see how much good came from his death. Maya said she thought he knew, and wherever he was proud of his sister. Lyria smiled and said she hoped so. The protection force continued after Lyria retired, and new generations of officers carried on the work, and they all knew the story of the elf woman and her dragon who had been sentenced to death but instead became heroes' children across the galaxy, grew up hearing tales of Maya, the human captain who stood up for justice when no one else would, and Lyria, the warrior who turned her grief into a force for good, and Ember, the dragon whose fire burned away evil. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and so permanent was now just a shameful chapter in history books, and the galaxy was better for its destruction. Sometimes on clear nights, Lyria would look up at the stars and remember all the battles and all the people they had saved and all the friends she had made. She thought about how her life could have ended in that council chamber so many years ago, and how one human woman had changed everything by simply refusing to let injustice stand. And she thought about how the darkest moments of her life had somehow led to the brightest, and how pain could be transformed into purpose if you were willing to fight for it. The galaxy was not perfect, and it never would be, and there were still people who needed saving and evil that needed stopping, but there were also people willing to do the saving and the stopping, and as long as that was true, there was hope. Lyria died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 347, surrounded by friends and former colleagues who had become family. At her funeral, Maya spoke, and she was nearly 100 years old herself, and her voice shook with emotion. She said that Lyria had taught her that redemption was always possible, and that even the deepest wounds could heal, and that one person really could change the galaxy. She said that the protection force would continue Lyria's legacy and would always stand for those who could not stand for themselves. Thousands attended the funeral from every corner of the galaxy, and they came to honor a hero and a friend and a symbol of hope. In the Hall of Memory, they placed a new statue next to Ember's, and it showed Lyria standing tall with her hand on her dragon's neck, and beneath it were the words, "She was sentenced to death but chose to live for others." And across the galaxy, in schools and homes and public squares, people told the story of the alien girl who faced execution and the human who spoke on her behalf, and how together they proved that justice and compassion could triumph over cruelty and corruption. It was a story that would be told for generations, and it would inspire countless others to stand up and fight for what was right. Because that is what heroes do, and that is what Lyria and Maya and Ember had been. Heroes not because they were perfect, but because when the galaxy needed someone to care, they cared, and when the galaxy needed someone to fight, they fought, and when the galaxy needed someone to believe in redemption, they showed that it was possible, and their legacy would live on forever in the hearts of those they saved, and in the society they helped build, and in the hope they gave to everyone who heard their story. The end was also a beginning because their work would never truly be finished, and that was exactly how they would have wanted it.